A number of years ago, maybe about, 15 or so, there was this book that came out entitled Mindset, The New Psychology of Success by Carol Dweck. Maybe some of you have heard it. It was fairly famous for a moment, at least. Its focus was on the structures of thinking that we have internalized without even realizing it, the ways of thinking we have by which we see. So the ways of thinking by which we think of ourselves or how we think of life or how we think of success. It speaks this idea of mindset, of kind of like these internal glasses. You're not even conscious of this grid, this way of seeing things. It's just the way that you think of things. And Dweck is specifically in her book focusing on two different kinds of mindset that she says can very much affect us, what she calls the fixed mindset and also a growth mindset. A fixed mindset, she says, is our general, some people have kind of this way of seeing self and seeing life as who they are is all they will ever be. And so when they encounter an obstacle, it just feels overwhelming. On the other hand, she says there's some who have a growth mindset. So they see themselves as people who can continue to change. And so when they experience an obstacle, that is an opportunity for them to grow. Two different mindsets where both people can look at the same thing, some sort of obstacle, and come to very different conclusions, leading to very different behaviors. What I think the book especially helps us to recognize is that mindset, the way that we think, can be an incredibly powerful thing. So this morning in our passage, we see Jesus addressing two kinds of mindset. So when you get to this interaction that we'll get to in a few minutes between Peter and Jesus in verse 33, he says to Peter, "You are not setting your mind," and I have to say this is a tricky phrase. This setting your mind is really more the idea of mindset. It's probably better translated, you are not thinking the things of God, but thinking the things of man. And the idea is a mindset. He's talking about two different ways of seeing, two different ways of thinking. There is, he says, a thinking that is in accordance with God, that comes from God, a divine mindset, if you will. And there is a different mindset, the one that Peter is displaying, that is what we might consider the default, the way that naturally people think. Two different mindsets that Jesus says is crucial to understand. And really, it is the heart of our passage to see the difference and to consider why they're so significant. What I'd like to do this morning is just kind of take two steps. First, to kind of like back up and see kind of what leads to this interaction between Jesus and Peter and how we see these two different mindsets. And then secondly, I'd like us to kind of understand what is this? What is this difference between these two ways of thinking and why are they important? So first, let's kind of back up a little bit and understand what leads to this interaction. We are in the Gospel of Mark at what many people consider a hinge. We're kind of concluding the first half of Mark, and we're beginning the second half. So this is a pivotal passage that we just read. And it starts with Jesus and his disciples kind of walking along a way to a village, and Jesus asking two questions. Who do people say that I am, and who do you say that I am? And just incidentally, this is yet another bit of evidence to show that Jesus, it's wrong to see Jesus as just kind of a great leader, a great teacher. I mean, imagine this. Imagine if you're at college and you have a teacher you really like, and at the end of the class, he gathers a few people after class, and he kind of quietly asks, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? I dare say you would probably drop that class, right? And you might talk to the dean about some mental instability that you're encountering. But that's not Jesus. Jesus is not just an ordinary teacher. Jesus is different, and he knows that the question of who he is extraordinarily significant. And really, it is the question that has been occupying this first half of the Gospel of Mark. We come back to it again and again. The people who first hear, what is this teaching? Who is this teacher with authority? And the Pharisees ask the question, who is this that says he can forgive sins? And even the disciples, after they see the miracle in the water, say, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Who is this? And we start seeing some answers coming in. The Pharisees, like, he's someone who's been possessed by Satan. His local neighbors from his hometowns, like, he's just Mary's son. Who does he think he is? Herod says, I think he's John the Baptist come back from the dead. Again and again, there's this question, who is this? And now we see the disciples answering this. As they're walking, Jesus says, so who are people saying? Who do you hear people say that I am? And they say, well, we know some people say you're John the Baptist. Other people say that you're a prophet, maybe even Elijah. And then Jesus asks this important climactic question, the personal question. Who do you say that I am? And I think actually Mark is inviting us to ask ourselves the same question right in the moment. We have been kind of walking with Jesus. We have been hearing him speak. We've been seeing what he does. And now we're meant to ask ourselves, who do you think Jesus is? Is he just a great leader? Is he a prophet? Is he a madman? Or is he something else? And Peter, I think on behalf of the disciples, answers, you are the Christ. And that word Christ is just the Greek word for Messiah, the Old Testament idea. Peter is saying, I don't think you're just a prophet. You're not just someone who is telling us how to live. You're not just someone who's preparing us for someone who is to come. You're the one that every prophet has been speaking about. You are the fulfillment of all of God's promises. You are the descendant of David. You are the king we have been longing for, who will make everything right. Jesus, that is what I believe. And Peter's right. We know he's right, actually, because Mark, in the very first verse of the entire book of Mark, tells us that Jesus is the Christ. Peter has a moment of insight. And yet, it's not complete. He sees things, but as we'll see, his mindset is misinterpreting it. It's like he's seeing, if you were here last week, people as trees walking. So then when we get to verse 31, we see here is that shift that I've already been mentioning. Something new begins. Notice how it says in verse 31, and he began to teach them things. He began. This is a new thing that he is beginning to teach. This is a shift. And the idea that it's beginning shows that this is going to be something that's going to take a while to unpack. In fact, it's going to take the rest of the Gospel of Mark to unpack the thing that Jesus starts teaching here in this moment. And what is that? He began to teach them, verse 31, that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now, Jesus here in these verses is weaving together 3 different strands of Old Testament prophecy that I'm not sure anyone ever brought together before. We've already seen the first when Peter says he is the Christ, that is this Davidic figure, the descendant of David who is going to bring a kingdom. And then you notice that Jesus refers to himself, as he often does, as the Son of Man, which is an allusion to the book of Daniel. And it's a title that perhaps we'll be able to spend more time looking at in future weeks. But suffice it to say for right now that the Son of Man, if anything, is an even loftier idea than the Christ. It is speaking of someone who will be given by God authority over all the world. It is a great king. But it's the third strand of prophecy that I especially want us to notice Jesus connecting to the other 2 this morning. In the book of Isaiah, there is this mysterious figure that develops starting around chapter 42, almost 2/3 of the way through the book. And it's one that commentators have begun just kind of naming the suffering servant. It's this person Isaiah prophesies who will one day come, who is going to be godly, loved by God, who is going to be righteous, filled with God's Spirit, and he will be sent by God to bring his people back to God. In fact, he will be such a great figure, a savior, that he won't just bring his people back, but he's actually going to bring the nations back to God. And the way that this suffering servant is going to do it is not through conquest, is not through military victory, it's not through leadership in that way, but through suffering. Isaiah says that he will be despised and rejected, a man of suffering. He will be cut off from the land of the living, that is, he will die. He will appear from every outward glance to be a failure. But Isaiah goes on to say that what people won't understand, but what will be true, is that all of that looks like failure is actually victory. Because the suffering he is doing to bring salvation to us. Isaiah says he will be pierced, but it'll be for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Through his wounds, we will be healed. And then Isaiah goes on to say that once that's happened, once he has achieved victory through suffering, then he will, it says, when his soul has made an offering for guilt, he will see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. Somehow, Isaiah says, after his horrible death, he will be vindicated by God. He will live. He will triumph. This mysterious prophecy lies in the background. Hear again what Jesus says in verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Do you hear the connection? Jesus is saying, yes, I'm the Christ. Yes, I am the Son of Man. I am the one who is going to make all things right. I'm going to bring the kingdom of God. And here's how I'm going to do it. Not through warfare, not through violence. I'm going to do it through suffering, because I'm also the suffering servant. I'm going to bring salvation by suffering, by being rejected by all the leaders of Israel, by dying, and then 3 days later by rising again. This is the first time that Jesus lays it out. The first time he's actually let the disciples know the full extent of his mission. You might notice how it says in verse 32, he said this plainly. He is now beginning to teach his disciples the very heart of the gospel. He's beginning to teach them about the cross. And it's at this moment that a division appears. It's at this moment a rift, a difference in mindsets comes to the surface. I like to imagine as Jesus is walking, and he has just said that as they continue to journey, the moment that he just said those words, Peter just stops. And he's just thinking for a moment about what he just heard. And then something visceral within responds. This must not be. This cannot be. And so he strides forward and he comes to Jesus. And it says he takes Jesus aside. And notice what it says he does in verse 32. He took him aside and began. So once again, before it was Jesus beginning to teach. Now Peter has his own agenda that he's trying to move Jesus back. He began to rebuke Jesus. That word is the same word that used for Jesus and the demons. Peter begins to rebuke Jesus. Jesus, this is wrong. Jesus, this is blasphemy. Jesus, you must not say these things. This cannot be. Now, on one hand, I think it's fairly obvious that rebuking the one that you just named as God's appointed Christ doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think we should at least take a moment and experience a bit of sympathy for where Peter's coming from. I mean, all of his life, Peter has been taught from his parents, from his teachers, that one day a great king will come, and that's the deepest heart's longing of his people, that they would see this Messiah who would make everything right. And to Peter's amazement, he has come to be in that day of seeing. And it's not just that he knows that he's in the day of the Messiah, he actually knows him personally. It's Jesus before him. There is just so much excitement. And now what is he hearing? That he's going to fail. Like fail in every way imaginable, that he's going to suffer, that all of the important people are going to reject him, that he is going to die. It sounds horrible. It can't be that. And I think we understand, right? It doesn't make sense. But Jesus doesn't sympathize in this moment. Jesus doesn't kind of gently go, Peter, I understand why you might say that. In fact, Jesus' response is brutal. Because I think it has to be brutal. Because the stakes are so high. Notice what Jesus says. Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. This is more than just a minor mistake, Jesus is saying. This is more than just Peter kind of like being impulsive. What's going on, Jesus is saying, is a rift that involves two different mindsets. You are not thinking according to the mindset of God. You're thinking according to the mindset of sinful humanity. There is Jesus' way, there is God's way of seeing things, and there is the way of sinful humanity. That's Peter's way of seeing things. Two different mindsets, and you see they're having two different evaluations of the same thing. Jesus says this is necessary, this is the right way. Peter says this must not be. And Jesus says, you are seeing things from a wrong perspective. You have the wrong mindset. It's the mindset that all of us naturally have. And Jesus is saying, if you're paying attention here, it is satanic. It is demonic. It is deeply, deeply wrong. I think that should get our attention. Because I think we understand why Peter is saying what he's saying, and Jesus is saying, be really careful. This is just completely opposite from how things should be. And so we need to ask, what is going on? What are these two mindsets? The mindset that is of God and the mindset that is of sinful humanity. How are we to understand them, and what does that look like for us in terms of how we're supposed to live this out? So let's take a step back and start thinking about that. It's interesting to me, actually, that this is not the only place. In fact, this is one of many places where the idea of these two mindsets appears throughout the New Testament. Paul especially talks a lot about this. In Romans, he'll talk about the mindset of the flesh and the mindset of the spirit. In Philippians, he'll talk about putting on the mindset of Jesus as opposed to the mindset that's oriented towards this world. Colossians will talk about a mindset that is above versus a mindset that is below. They're all talking about the same thing, the thing that Jesus has identified here, the mindset that is of God and the mindset that is of sinful humanity. And at essence, these two mindsets are both trying to answer the same question. How do I get life? What is the pathway towards life in terms of what I want, a life that is full, a life that is joyful? Both of these mindsets are ways of thinking about how to get to that destination. The mindset of sinful humanity says the answer to that question is ultimately, it's up to me. That the way for me to get a good life is through my own effort, through working hard, through achieving. That the way to happiness is increasingly for me to gain control and to make my life the way I want it to be. Meanwhile, the mindset that is of God is saying the way towards life is not up to me, but it's up to God. It doesn't happen through my own effort. It happens as a gift. And the pathway is not by control. The pathway is through trusting. Do you hear the difference? Is the way to get the life that we want, is it of God or is it up to me? Is it about effort or is it about grace? Is it about control or is it about trust? Regarding the mindset of sinful humanity, we see Jesus in verse 35 talking about this. That's how it begins when he says, "For whoever would save his life," that's what he's talking about. This desire to not just save your life, but to protect it. It's the mindset of saying the way for me to be able to make things okay is by taking control, by asserting dominance. The way that I can get approval is by climbing up the ladder of status. The way that I can get people to like me is by doing whatever I can to please them. The way that I can make things safe for me is by acquiring wealth. It's about my effort. That's how I do it. And if that is how we see it, that it is all about that kind of climbing, that grasping, that taking, then from that perspective, what Jesus just said to Peter does make no sense. It sounds absolutely horrible. I mean, the way to happiness is not through suffering, it's through taking control. The way to the glory that we long for is through finding the most impressive and powerful people and gaining their approval. It's not through being rejected by them. And the way to greatness is certainly not through dying, it's through winning. By the mindset of sinful humanity, what Jesus is saying makes absolutely no sense. But what Jesus says in verse 35 is the only reason it doesn't make sense is because that mindset is blinding you. Because what you think, your intuitions, everything that kind of makes you think it's up to me, it's blinding you from reality. Notice what he says in verse 35 is really the case. Whoever would save his life, whoever seeks to grab control of it, will lose it. It is exactly the wrong way to find the life that we want. And actually, I suspect if we just take a moment to think about it, and to think about where this kind of instinct leads, we actually can start seeing how it plays out in normal life. Let me ask you, if you are really worried about all the threats and dangers in this world, and so you make it your life's project to become safe, to safety-proof everything, to make sure that you have plenty of money in your bank account, to make sure you have every kind of insurance, to make sure you're doing everything that keeps you as healthy as possible, do you think that will make you calmer and more secure as a result? Or think of this, if you know people who have just kind of made it their life's project to gain other people's approval, that is always what they're fighting for, that's always what they're striving for, are those the people that you admire the most? Or people who really want to be happy, and so they're constantly asking, what makes me happy? They're always trying to do whatever makes them happy. Do you think those are the people who are generally the most content? It doesn't work. It doesn't work because we were never meant to be the ones who make ourselves secure and happy and loved. That's not our job. That's God's role. And the tragic irony, and it is truly tragic, is that this very attempt to assert control and to take over the role that belongs to God actually means that we keep pushing further and further away the one person who can truly give us joy and security and love. The one who tries hard to save their lives, they'll lose it, Jesus said. That is the destination of the mindset of the sinful flesh, where it is up to me. That's how we understand how to get life. It is a dead end. But there is an alternative. It's not the one that comes naturally to any of us, but it is what we see in Jesus, what Jesus speaks of as thinking the things of God, or the mindset of God. And the Apostle Paul summarizes for us in Philippians what the mindset that we see in Jesus actually looks like. In Philippians it says, Jesus, and listen to how different this is from what we were just describing. Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider being equal with God something to be used to his own advantage. Instead, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. And he humbled himself, and he became obedient even unto death. If the mindset of sinful humanity is always climbing upwards, do you hear how different it is that Jesus, having everything, didn't grasp tightly, didn't say, I need to keep on climbing, but instead he surrendered it all. He allowed himself to be made nothing. In obedience to God, he gave everything, even death. It is the exact opposite direction. And if we just stopped there, I think we would be still admiring Jesus and the way that we experience his love and his sacrifice. But that's actually not to understand fully the point that Paul is making. And it's not to understand fully what the mindset that comes from God looks like. Because it doesn't end there. After those verses, it says, therefore, God exalted Jesus to the highest place and gave him the name above all names, that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess him as the Lord over heaven and earth. In other words, when Jesus goes low, it is not him just giving up on victory. It's not just him giving up on glory. It's not just him giving up on joy. It's something very different. It's him saying, I know the pathway. The pathway to glory and joy and victory comes in trusting God and relinquishing and letting him do it in his own timing. It's the same thing that Peter, I'm sure, missed when Jesus said, remember again, what does Jesus say? He says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus is not saying, I'm going to defeat. He's saying, I'm going to victory. He's not saying, I'm going to a final destination of humiliation. He's saying, I'm going to glory. But his mindset understands it's a very different pathway. It's not a pathway of climbing. It's not a pathway of making sure you take control. It's a pathway of trusting God and knowing that God, in his own timing, is going to give everything that Jesus longs for. And so it looks radically different. When Jesus, in verse 34, speaks of how this has to mean for us, its implications, I think people misunderstand this verse frequently. It's one of the most quoted verses in this passage, where Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And I think what people hear when we hear those words is it's a call for heroic sacrifice. To give up on pleasure, to give up on anything good, to give up on any of our dreams and hopes, and suffer it all because we're a Christian. And I want to suggest that is a deeply wrong understanding of what Jesus is saying. The entire idea of heroic sacrifice, all that does is it puts us back in the place where we were before, where it's up to me. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not calling for heroic sacrifice. He's calling for helpless surrender. The self we are to deny is that project that we had where we were saying, it's up to me. I have to work. I have to work. I have to make it work to make myself happy. And Jesus says you have to let that go. You have to surrender that. You have to say, it's no longer up to me. I no longer identify with that previous person. I lose that life that I once had. And I say, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go, and I'm going to trust wherever it is you're taking me will be what I want. Notice what Jesus says in the second half of 35. It's not just a warning. Whoever save his life will lose it. But it's also a promise. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. All that you long for, the glory, the joy, the security, all will be given to you if you lose control and allow me to be the one who takes you home. Whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. Do you hear the different mindset? The looking at life and saying, it's not about control, it's about God. It's not about control, it's about trust. It's about grace. And it changes everything about the way that we are. It orients us instead of trying to take, to obey, to give a life of love, and to allow God to do what he is going to do in his own timing. C.S. Lewis, I think, captures it really well when he says, give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in. That is the mindset that is of God. And that is the pathway to life. And before I close, let me just say one more thing. What Jesus is speaking of here, and I hope you're beginning to see it, he's speaking of something beautiful. He's speaking of something good, something that he himself exemplifies. But he's also speaking of something that, humanly speaking, is impossible. I don't just say that from kind of personal experience. We actually, later on, the next chapters are going to be kind of like pulling this out. And there's this one moment where this man who is rich, who is impressive, comes and he wants eternal life. He wants life. And Jesus says, here's what you need to do. You need to let go. You need to let go of your riches and follow me. It's exactly what's being talked about in chapter 8. And what happens? It says, the young man can't do it. He goes away sad. And Jesus says, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for him to have done what I called him to do. He says it's impossible. But then he says what is impossible with man is possible with God. And if this morning you feel exposed in any way, if you recognize there's something about what Jesus is saying, but it feels just terrifying, I want to suggest you're right. There is so much in us that wants to cling to control. There's so much fear within us that we can't open our hands on our own. But here's what we can do. We can ask Jesus for help. We can turn to Jesus because with him, what is impossible becomes possible. And you know what? He is the King who came to serve. He is the King who came to bring us back to God. He is the King who hears and saves. Invite us, wherever we are at this morning, to turn to God right now, to turn to Jesus, asking for help, to acknowledge our failures and our weakness, and to look to him for strength. And in a couple of minutes, I will lead us in prayer.